Breakfast with Friends on CCFm 107.5.
Well, it gives us great joy to welcome to our studios Mr. Nico Kleynhans. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Last Thursday, I spoke of making a difference, and he generated a lot more comments than is usual. Some people comment directly on the video so we can see. Others use the email address, and then, of course, some WhatsApp so we get the feedback while the talks are happening. Today, I want to follow up on that, and it's a much more difficult theme, but I want to talk about living with dignity. And I want to talk about a community that I belong to. And this community meets or used to meet in the dead center of town. And about a third of our worshippers were street or homeless people. So it was an unusual congregation with very different needs. And we gathered that many people because we had a very strict policy that our job was to create a safe place. And our job was to create a space where people could grow and experience love, because we recognized that a lot of our congregants had experienced enormous amounts of rejection. So there are not many services that when you go into the church, there are soap and cloth packs lying in plastic bags at the back. And there are not many that on regular intervals will have piles of second-hand clothing there. Now, we needed to do that because a lot of people, especially people who get on the streets for the first time, become desperate about cleanliness. There are not many places where you can shower. And there are not many garages who will allow you into their public toilets. So you have this as a problem. In addition to that, as a person who lives on the streets, your clothes get stolen all the time. So you have great difficulty replacing. And so most inner city homeless people are not going to be comfortable in a typical congregational space. So let me tell you about Joe. Joe was 35 years old, and he and his wife and children stayed in what is known as a family home. Now, this is a phenomenon I've seen in Cape Town, but not seen in many other parts of the city. And what happens is a matriarch or a patriarch dies and then leaves the home to all of their children to be shared. And the idea is that anybody in that clan who needs a safe place can move into that particular home. It's a disaster when it comes to working out who's who in the zoo, but it's a way of providing protection, especially if you're in a community where unemployment is fairly high. Now, Joe moved into one of those homes, and it didn't take too long when life became more difficult and he lost his job. And now his sisters and brothers became irritated because from their perspective, Joe was not trying to find another job, and they were having to feed his family. So from their perspective, he was just being lazy. And eventually it got to the point where they kicked him out. His wife and children could stay, but he had to go. And I've seen that happen in these family homes. Now, at 35, that's not a good time to become homeless for the first time in your life. And when he visited us for the first time, he complained that because he couldn't keep himself clean, it became even more difficult for him to go job hunting. And he wasn't able to identify that his inability to job hunt was also because of depression. So it wasn't that he was lazy, as his family was saying. He was depressed because he felt really, really bad. Now, the problem is that when you become homeless, you've got to make a lot of changes. I've expressed my criticism of how the city deals with it. And in the city center, they have these huge cages that are built under the freeways. And the idea is that you can go there at night, the cage will be opened, and then 50 or 60 of you can go inside and there is a security guard on duty, and the cage is locked and you are supposed to be safe. And one of the things the security guard has to do is at the middle of the day and in the evening, he's got to give you a bottle of water. It's surprisingly difficult to get hold of water if you're on the streets. And if the security guard was in any way an angry person, they would often withhold that water. And if a fight broke out, the security guard would turf everybody out of the cage, lock the cage, and now you've got Metro Police to deal with. So he was really struggling to make the connection. And the problem is when you become homeless, you often lose track because your family doesn't know where you are. And if you're frustrated, you don't want to make contact with the family. So that was Joe, one of the members. The second was of a young man who was Zimbabwean. He'd lost his employment. He'd moved onto the street. At his home country, he was a qualified school teacher, but he couldn't get papers in South Africa. And so he came to us to try and get papers for him so that at least he could be on the street, so that if he is raided, he could show the papers and he wouldn't then be locked up and sent back. Now, he then survived off day-to-day jobs, and it got to the critical stage where he was absolutely destitute and had absolutely nothing to survive. He eventually got himself a job. And not only that, the employer agreed to give him accommodation. And the big thing about when you get a job for the first time, you get paid at the end of the month, but you've got to pay your accommodation at the beginning of the month. This employer understood and made a plan and said, let's do this. So he'd been in job for 3 days and he came to church. And as he was telling me his story, he went into a fit and collapsed on the ground. Now, fortunately, our congregation has a medical practitioner as a member, and she's in charge of a hospital, so she knows whatever we're going to find amongst our members, she knows what it's all about. But as he collapsed, he pointed to his pocket, and I realized that there were tablets in his pocket, and he wanted me to understand what the tablets meant. Now, I didn't. I took the tablets, I called the doctor, she cleared everybody out of the aisle and had a conversation with him. And eventually I noticed he nodded, and she called me and said, I need to tell you something. He's given us permission. He has just been diagnosed and is HIV positive. And he's reacting to the medication. And he needs to get to hospital tonight. And he's going to be there for at least 24 hours because they've got to change the medication. And I knew at this point, now he's got a new job, the new employer might not understand. So what we had to do in that space was to get him to hospital. I had to contact the employer. There was very limited information that I can give the employer, but I showed him that he was at church. I know that he is sick. I know that he's in hospital. He will be back at work in 2 days' time. And so we were able to turn that around. Now, the important thing at that moment in time is for me to be aware of what his immediate needs are and not to make a judgment call on what he did to survive. I'm not walking in his shoes. I have absolutely no right to do that. And that's what I'm saying, when you're working with people who need to learn to live in dignity, it is often our preconceived ideas that make that difficult. Well, Joe, our original person, eventually was able to make contact with his family. There was reconciliation. He is getting treatment for his depression. He is able to move back with his family. And for all practical purposes, there is healing that is happening. For our second young man, as part of his process of healing, he had to return to Zimbabwe to have an important conversation with his parents. He's back in South Africa because this is the only place he can get the treatment that he needs. He's now living in another city. He is stable. He's getting his job and his life together. That is what I believe that we are called to do. Now, if I, in a dream world, were ever able to be the president of South Africa, I would want to ensure that in every town, city and village, there is some place set aside for basic structures for homeless to live on. Not cages. They're not circus animals. They shouldn't have to live in that kind of condition. Where social workers are available, because for many of these people, they have real issues, and they're emotional issues that drove them to the streets in the first place. And we need to be creating safe places where they can work. Now, are there Christian organizations doing it? Yes, there are plenty. But the only issue that I want to make here is that people need to live with dignity, regardless of who they are. And within our group as Christians, we can do so much more than we are doing now, creating places that are safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nico Kleynhans.